No, no one's going to say anything.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our fifth and final webinar on this Gender Action Plus webinar series, Let's Talk, Let's Act, Addressing Discrimination in Danish Higher Education. We are already online and the first people are coming in. For those of you who are already here, feel free to already use the chat to maybe put in a hi and your name and from where you're calling in from, which country or city or university, and then we're just going to wait another minute or two for everyone to come in. Again, warm welcome to everyone who has just come in. Welcome to our fifth session on the Gender Action Plus webinar series. You're super welcome to already use the chat and say hi and maybe put in from where you're calling in from, so we have an idea of who is in this online space with us today. And then we'll just give everyone another minute to arrive. I can still see the numbers are going up. People are entering. So for those of you coming in, welcome. You're welcome to share on the chat where you're calling in from, say hi, and I'll get going in, let's say, 45 seconds. All right, then I would say, let's begin. Again, warm welcome to the fifth and actually final session on this webinar series, Let's Talk, Let's Act, Addressing Discrimination in Higher Education. My name is Bontu Gushke. I am a researcher, a facilitator, and a consultant in the area of anti-discrimination, academia, and beyond, which means that I give trainings and workshops and coachings on anti-discrimination in organizations, in universities, and teams. A lot of that being based on my own research on the persistence of racist and sexist discrimination at workplaces and universities. And I'm here today as the moderator for this webinar series. So I'm going to lead us through this session, which I'm very much looking forward to. I'm here together with Molly Okino, and I will just let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bonto. Very excited to be here again today, this week. My name is Molly Okino, and I'm a diversity and inclusion special consultant in the gender equality team here at the University of Southern Denmark. My background is in gender studies and social science, and I'm currently finishing my PhD dissertation at the Department of Social Science at Roskilde University. I'm here together with my colleague, Liuba Eisen-Petersen, who is head of the gender equality team. And you maybe say hi. And we are the project partners in the Gender Action Plus project together with the Ministry of Higher Education and Science. We're very excited to be here today together with Bonto and our wonderful speakers and for this really important session. So thanks.
Thank you, Molly. And yeah, again, really warm welcome from all three of us, from Molly, Leo, and myself. We're here today also with three amazing speakers, Mira, Skadegård, Sheena, Vacchani, and Mira, Plotnikof. Welcome also to the three of you. I will introduce each of you in more detail later on. But before I do that, I actually just wanted to say a couple of words on what brings us here today. You already heard me say it. This is already our final webinar session on addressing discrimination in higher education over the past 5 weeks. We've been coming together every Thursday to speak about different forms and different aspects of discrimination in higher education and how to actually build a less discriminatory university context that actively fights against racism, sexism, ableism, queerphobia, transphobia, and other forms of discrimination and inequalities. These issues are not only highly relevant, but they're also gladly discussed more and more, not least since the Me Too movement started spreading into Danish academia in 2020. And we actually have one of the people here with us today who was a part of starting the Me Too movement in Danish academia. Mira is in fact one of the co-organizers of the petition that collected more than 800 testimonials about harassment and discrimination from researchers in Denmark. And with this petition, and of course a lot of work from the collective afterwards, managed to put a lot of attention on issues on harassment and discrimination in higher education. Of course, this has been a relevant topic long before that, as all of us who work in this field know. But I think it really needed that push, and we hope that it continues to be a priority at Danish universities. Indeed, just last year, the research institute VIVE published a report on sexism at Danish universities that was commissioned by the Ministry of Higher Education and Science as a response to the Me Too movement hitting Danish academia. And the findings of this VIVE report show that scholars, especially junior scholars, continuously experience sexist and also other intersectional forms of discrimination in Danish higher education institutions. And that was how this idea came about to have this webinar series, Let's Talk, Let's Act, Addressing Discrimination in Danish Higher Education. As mentioned before, the webinar series is headed by the gender equality team at SDU, so Leo and Molly. And it is also part of the Danish National Impact Plan in the EU Gender Action Plus project. Some of you might have heard about this project before. It's an EU project that consists of partners from 22 EU member states that are working on the coordination of gender equality and inclusiveness objectives of the new ERA, the European Research Area. So really thinking on the one hand side very broadly, but then also very specifically about how to foster equality and inclusion in higher education and research across the EU. And as part of that, we think it's very important that we talk explicitly about discrimination in higher education and that we do that from an intersectional perspective. And to make sure that we actually do that from an intersectional perspective, we have set up this webinar series consisting of 5 webinars. 4 out of those 5 we've already had. We talked about racism and racist discrimination, about sexism and gender inequalities, about anti-queerness and anti-transness, and also about neurodiversity and ableism. Today, in our final session, we want to bring some of the insights from our prior sessions together and kind of looking at what were the main themes that we kept coming back to throughout the series, and based on that, speak about the overarching question of how to implement meaningful and intersectional DEI work in universities. And I'm super happy to see that we have more than 60 people from more than 35 different universities and research institutions across Europe. And I think even beyond that, in this online space with us to discuss this question. That's really amazing. So thank you to everyone who is here with us today. I actually also know that several of you have been here also for our other webinars, so you're also already perfectly prepared for today. And as we really talked about a lot of different issues, it would be impossible to try and summarize all of it. But what I do want to do is to just point out 4 themes or insights that I think have been coming up throughout the 4 sessions, and that I think provide an important basis for our discussion today. The first one that I want to mention is the unspeakability of many forms of discrimination. So this problem that certain forms of discrimination remain Unspeakable, meaning they're not addressed, they're ignored, they're sidelined. There's a certain uncomfortableness or maybe even unwillingness to address them. And to speak with Sarah Ahmed here, we cannot solve a problem if we do not give it a name. And if a problem is not given a name, we often become the problem when we name it. Which also relates to issues of minority tax and effective labor that comes with anti-discrimination work. Ea Utoft, for example, spoke about this in relation to sexism in our second session. Irem Kavaya also referred to it when she spoke about experiences of women of color in academia. And then last week, when we spoke about ableism and disableism with Antonius Kinidis and Olivia Dahl, we kind of extended this thought to also think about how do we then speak about inequalities and discrimination, how important it is that we do not speak about them as something that the individual needs to fix, but as a systemic and structural problem, which means we have to ask what can we change in the context, in the structures, in the processes in higher education to prevent discrimination. So it matters that we speak about it, and it also matters how we speak about it. A second and related theme carrying through the series is that it is, and that is particularly relevant for the Danish context, is the concept and the idea of Nordic exceptionalism and how this narrative that equality has already been achieved in Denmark, or as Ea Utoft spoke about, how Denmark is seen as post-feminist, makes it particularly challenging to point out inequalities and discrimination. Irem Kavaya, for example, spoke about the connection between colonial continuities, white innocence, and Nordic exceptionalism. And Irina Schmidt highlighted how gender equality work often becomes very narrow in the Scandinavian context because of how equality is framed as gender equality and then narrated as something that has already been achieved, which, for example, overlooks the consistent and continuous struggles and fights of queer and trans elders, as much as it ignores issues of anti-queerness and anti-transness today. And more generally speaking, I would say also dismisses any kind of intersectional equality work. The third point that I briefly want to bring in is about the importance of understanding the context of higher education. Sometimes there seems to be this myth that within higher education, everyone is so educated that here we don't have these problems of racism or sexism or ableism. But as Anke Lipinski's research showed, higher education is an inherently discriminatory context, especially because of how it is set up. That's also something that the Viva report that I mentioned points out, for example, showing that because of the hierarchical and precarious work context that we have in higher education, and also because of these insecurity triggering narratives of competition and excellence, it's especially junior scholars who are at a particular risk of being harassed and discriminated against, and as Anke's research showed, even more unlikely to speak up or report their experiences. So we need to understand how the context of higher education works and how it facilitates inequalities and discrimination. And then finally, I want to stress a point that Doyen Atevolugun brought up in our first webinar, in which I think we've discussed in almost all the sessions, which is the need for consistent allyship and solidarity. Doyen was sharing some really good resources on how to be an ally against racism and also other forms of discrimination. And one of her main points was do something and then do it consistently. Because allyship and solidarity and equality work are not one-off things. So no matter what you do it with consistency and with commitment. Again, this is by far not an exhaustive overview. We talked about so much more, but I think it's some of the points that make sense to keep in mind as we move into today's session. How will today's session work? What can you expect? And importantly, also, how can all of you in the audience contribute? So we will, in a moment, give our speakers, Mia, Sheena, and Mira, about 10 minutes each for a brief input that we ask them to prepare relating to the theme of today's session, We know that 10 minutes is short, but it's really just meant as an opener for our discussion, because after their inputs, we will have plenty of time for a discussion with the three of them to dive deep into our questions of how to deal with discrimination in higher education, how to develop a norm-critical organizational culture, and how to implement meaningful DEI work in universities. For this discussion, we would love to get your questions, comments, and insights. And for that, we will be using the Q&A function where you can post your questions. So you can do that at any point. You don't have to wait until the discussion. You can already, during the inputs, use the Q&A function, put your questions in there, and Molly will then collect them and bring them in when we get to the discussion. Please don't use the raised hand function. Please also don't use the general chat where I just ask you to say hi in the beginning. Please use the Q&A because that is the channel that we will be monitoring. We also want to make you aware that we do not tolerate any form of discrimination. So if there are any comments or questions that we perceive as discriminatory or hostile towards our speakers, we will not pass them on. But apart from that, we will do our very best to answer as many of your questions as possible. So I'll be leading us into the discussion with some of my questions, and then we'll pick up your questions from the Q&A as we go through. That being said, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first wonderful speaker, which is Mira Skadegård. We're super happy to have Mira with us here today. She is a very important voice in the area of anti-racism and anti-discrimination in Denmark, working both as a researcher and also as a practitioner, and also being an important part of the Danish public discourse around inequalities. Mira is an associate professor at Aalborg University in Copenhagen and has a PhD in structural discrimination. She's also senior advisor in social sustainability and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Taking an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach, Mira's research focuses on structural and systemic forms of discrimination and oppression in everyday educational and organizational contexts, on social sustainability and diversity, and on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and human rights. And I think this is what has always really impressed me in your work, Mira, how you bring together the structural and systemic and thinking about equality on a level of human rights with then the very concrete experiences in the everyday, in organizations, in education. I think this kind of bridging is immensely important, and I think your work contributes to that in a very valuable way. But yeah, before I end up talking too much about what I think about your work and I like about your work, I better hand over to you so that we can actually hear from you. So Mira, very warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. Thanks, Bantu. Yeah, I guess I don't need to say much about this. I have a background in a very humanities-oriented space, which is philosophy and anthropology and literary theory. So I don't come from a science background or a legal background, which sometimes it can be the thought when you hear about the human rights perspective. I was asked to speak, and thank you for inviting me for today very much. I look forward to the conversation. I was asked to talk a little bit about Nordic exceptionalism and some of the paradoxes that are inherent in this whole mindset that we've all inherited in the Nordics, certainly, and there's exceptionalism in all contexts in all parts of the world, but Nordic exceptionalism in particular is a form of exceptionalism which is a way of referring to the way in which we in the Nordics invest very heavily in a notion of equality, an ideology of equality. And this has been going on at least since the end of the Second World War, where we see a paradigm shift and we see a very, very strong move away from and rejection of many of the ideological trends and tendencies that were before. And we see the Nordics take some very active decisions about becoming more equitable in the way they practice society. So we see the development of the welfare state. We see very many different ways in which we try to support equity in the Nordic context. And we see a very clear rejection of colonialism and racism and discrimination, and work with gender equality. And we do a whole lot of things that sort of show that on the one hand, a very, very strong investment in human rights and equity. And at the same time, it's an interestingly naive process, because we think at some level that because we just have decided this is the case and now we're done with that, let's wipe our hands of that. And then further, we seem to have thought that might have been enough, or at least it seems to have progressed to a point now where we no longer feel it's necessary to invest in the knowledge and the competency and the understandings of the mechanisms that actually brought us to that point in the first place and gave us something to reject in the first place. So exceptionalism is sort of what has happened since, so to speak, this notion of being above racism, being above discrimination, being beyond it, and being, yeah, I guess that's the best way to describe it. And one of the paradoxes, there's so many paradoxes in this, it's super interesting, because on the one hand, it speaks to a really strong desire at some level, a collective desire to not be racist, to not want to oppress and exploit, to want to have the good identity that we like, of course, a normative good identity. On the other hand, there's no way around the arrogance and the naivete that would place the notion that we could be above it like that, and that we think all of a sudden, because we've decided it, well, then that's that then. There's this a rejection or a lack of awareness of the knowledge required to understand which mechanisms, which dynamics, which processes had to be existent, had to be in place, had to provide the situation we were taking distance from to start with. And that's one paradox, is this notion that you can just decide against it and that's it, and not realize how these mechanisms, of course, will, if you think of it as bringing like a carpet down, or a curtain down, and saying, well, everything behind that curtain we're done with, let's go on, without thinking about how all this structural and systemic and all of the different ideological mechanisms, of course, are going to sneak under that carpet or that curtain, and into different ways in which we practice on the other side of the curtain. So there's this sort of notion that you can just, that we're so developed, we're so evolved, that we can just reject this concept. So there's that. And it's complicated, because it comes out of wanting to be the good, which we all want to do. So there's that. And then there's also this other aspect of it, that now we're the good guys. So we're the saviors, we're the benevolent people, we're those that look at the others that are doing bad things and look down at them, look at what they're doing in South Africa, look at what they're doing in the United States. At this point, I'm thinking of things like Jim Crow, and I'm thinking of things like apartheid. So you've got this whole creating a counter identity to all those bad guys, because now we've become the good guys. And we've developed the human rights with everybody else, and say all of this. So there's these interesting sort of, I don't know if you'd call them paradoxes, but certainly dissonances in how we're developing this notion of self. And one of the really big tragedies in this is that we remain invested or situated in an ideological racism understanding. Meaning, we don't actually develop our racism and discrimination knowledge. We don't stay in line, we don't follow the research and the knowledge development in all other fields in the rest of the world around discrimination, inequity, human rights, etc. We've just presumed that we're above it, we know what we're doing, we are there, so we don't need to follow along. And what we see is in the Nordics a very strong tendency to have no department studying this, no investment in research, no lens directed out at what's actually happening in the knowledge development in this field. So what we're finding now, I mean, this is simple, 10 minutes, we can't get into all the details, but if you think about it, if you just clip to now, we're still seeing in many everyday understandings of discrimination and racism and even gender, etc., we're seeing this idea that it's about the individual, it's about intention, it's about believing in biological race, it's all of this old-fashioned racism, what we call ideological racism, and very little knowledge and understanding of racism as systemic and structural, collective, institutional, or at the micro level, and not understanding how these mechanisms are in place. So there's this you could call it like a dissonance or like a tug of war or something, or certainly a contrast between knowledge and research about discrimination and racism versus this idea that it's about being a good person, moral person, or having an opinion. So you've got this knowledge versus opinion concept going on. And many people having not had access to education or knowledge development around this field believe they know what discrimination is because it's situated in this idea of being a good person, of having the right beliefs, having the right opinions. So there's that. And then this lack of study and this lack of research of this field has also led us to understand that discrimination and racism is very much a individualized process. And it's all about, again, belief as opposed to identifiable practices, identifiable actions, things we can actually regulate, which is the discrimination itself. Does that make, I'm hoping that's making sense. So these are some of the things that have given us, yeah, I guess you'd have to say some serious challenges in trying to understand, because we're spending so much time trying to protect our identity and our innocence and our goodness and who we are as people without understanding that just doing that turns again this issue of oppression and exploitation into a story about the majoritized subject as opposed to the minoritized subject. So there's this kind of a dilemma or a paradox in that, because you're actually taking all the attention to protecting your own position as a majoritized position. This can be collective, can be as a national identity, but it can also be at the individual level. So these are the kinds of troubles I'm seeing in how we have put ourselves in a kind of a terrible position by not keeping up with the knowledge around this field. I mean, discrimination, racism research about inequity is a scientific field. It has been being studied for well over 100 years. We have a lot of research and a lot of knowledge around this, and we are not aware of that to any real degree in the Nordics. And that creates some of these dissonances. So those were some of the things I was going to say, is that we're sort of stuck in this old way of thinking about it, and without the tools and without the comfort to talk about it, because we haven't had the knowledge, we haven't had the possibility of learning about it in school, in high school, in university. We don't have the language, we don't have the comfort with those dialogues, and we're only basically able to talk about it in this very contentious way that we're seeing, for example, in the public dialogue. So what do we need? I guess I could have sort of round off with, what do we really need if we want to work with this? Because it's not hopeless, we can do it. It's not rocket science. It's been done. It's doable. One of them is the acknowledging that we even have an issue, that it is structural, it is institutional, and it is, of course, also individual, because we've learned and we've inherited discrimination as a part of the air we breathe. So acknowledging that we have a problem, and finding a way to develop professional, qualified, research-based, in my opinion, knowledge around this. So we need the knowledge, we need the acknowledgement, and we really need training and competency, because knowledge is up here. Doing it is embodied. Learning how to practice without the discomfort, or learning to be in that discomfort in order to practice. So those are sort of the three things I think that are needed if we're going to try and make it more concrete. Yeah, so things around the effective processes, the ways in which we speak about things, the ways in which we position ourselves as subjects, and how we also invite people into conversations, and the extreme need to be very aware of our positions. What is our actual identity position, or our privilege, or our platform, and in which ways can we use that best without, again, centering ourselves? I think I'd like to end with those 3 points or 4 points, or however many points I just ended up with.
Thank you so much, Mira. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for sharing these important insights, which I think pick up on a lot of the things that we have talked about in this webinar series on these paradoxes. Thank you for drawing them out so clearly for us, and also extending that with your perspective on racism and discrimination, knowledge and education, which I think I would love to also pick up on again in the discussion when we get to that. Thank you, Mira. I would like to move on to our second speaker, which is Sheena Vacchani. Sheena is a professor of work and organization at the University of Bristol Business School in the UK. She is also an expert consultant for Inspire, the Horizon Europe Centre of Excellence on Inclusive Gender Equality in Research and Innovation. Sheena's research explores social inequalities, especially ethics, politics, and difference in work and organization, and how they relate to social transformation and social justice across multiple axes of oppression. She has a particular interest in craft work, materiality and embodiment, and a long-standing interest in using critical perspectives to teach and research leadership. And I actually remember that I came across Sheena's work when I was still a PhD student and working on sexism and racism and discrimination, and at some point started to look for and really felt a need to read more also about solidarity and feminist organizing. And this is how I actually came across Sheena's work on effective solidarity, on feminist organizing and feminist ethics, also on feminist embodied writing. And I think much of that has been very not only informative, but also inspiring to my own work of bringing together this very critical and at the same time, as I always found it to be also hopeful work. So Sheena, I'm very happy and excited that you're joining us here today, and I hand over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks so much, Pontu. I hope you can hear me. That was another really generous and really motivational introduction, I guess. And I want to extend my thanks to you and to Molly and to everyone who've organised these series of events that gives us a much needed space for reflection, but also one that helps, I think, push our field and praxis forward. And I think many of the things I'll touch on, you've already brought up, so hopefully it kind of squares that circle and connects back to some of the other events that you've had. I framed this brief talk really around the idea of kind of progress and feminist praxis, exploring how we can think about futures for organising differently and what it means sort of ethically and politically to engage in meaningful DEI work in the universities we find ourselves. And I think it's important to start with how integral equity work has been for making the invisible visible. And it's been hugely important for really pushing and creating so much progress that we cannot lose. But in the same instance, DEI work feels like it's precarious work in multiple senses, precarious because of the workers and practitioners doing it and the lack of security there, but also because progress is not linear. There are winding paths, wins and losses, and sometimes we can't always see when either is the case. And so I guess part of this work for me is focusing on how we construct or understand the future, imagining feminist futures, how we assemble, challenge, and transform these conditions we find ourselves in across intersectional dimensions of race, class, age, genders, sexualities, ableism, as has already been mentioned. So I really want to raise, in a sense, the question of what does it mean to open up dialogue when equity pushes at institutional structures that do not move? And Bontu's already mentioned Sara Ahmed, and I will again. And Sara Ahmed puts it in this way: we face walls and we are turned into brick walls when we speak uncomfortable truths. So in Ahmed's words, when she talks about academic walls, when we speak about what we come up against what we speak about. That's to say, walls come up when we talk about walls that we face. And I think that's the kind of real, sometimes contradiction or tension we find ourselves facing, is that we find ourselves in particular kinds of oppositional politics, some of which are necessary in university contexts, but often in those contexts, universities cannot often bear the weight of difference, and they tend to be peculiarly conservative and often better at shutting down difference than keeping it open, perhaps even more so in the context of global attacks on DEI, which will lead to backlash and more potent forms of silencing. So I guess I want to highlight three areas I think we need to be particularly mindful of, and that offer ways of maybe embedding reflexive dialogue for meaningful equity work. So not collapsing into more instrumental, sometimes, cumulative policy creation that doesn't always at its heart address the assumptions and values that underpin different types and categories and experiences of difference. And so that the first issue, or the first kind of question I want to highlight are the politics of different experiences and empathies. How we speak across difference matters, and whose experiences listened to matters as well. And this is mostly, I think we maybe agree, or many of us would agree, that this is mostly unequal in universities. And we often talk about speaking through our own positionality, but there are always different degrees to which those different positionalities are mobilized or recognized or misrecognized or even silenced by the universities that we inhabit. So collectively, we might try and get students, as well as our own academic communities, to really think about their own positions. But we don't often talk always about how this occludes or exposes different types of viewpoints, or how it politicizes difference in different ways. And I'm going to connect to what Bontu was saying, that there's also an unspeakability to some aspects of DEI work, and also a hierarchy. So depending on your context, it can be harder to talk about gender or race. And certainly in the UK environment, gender has been to some extent mainstreamed, and that we can talk about it more freely than we would talk about race, for example, or even class or sexuality. So who gets to talk about it? Who gets to advocate for it and have a voice, and who gets to speak seems to be a very important question. And I think collectively we need to surface these conversations much more through the structures of DEI work, in the institutionalized structures of DEI work in universities, because we all know that this informal labor exists as well. So focusing more on appreciating differences in our experiences, but also how they become commodified, turned into forms of capital or ways of dividing us as well as connecting us, and how empathy can be quite selective and mobilized in different ways. And I think this relates to my second point, which has already been brought up by Bontu and also Mira, is that it's really related to different forms of allyship, solidarity, and effective labor, and recognizing who is doing the labor of equity work. So often we see equity practitioners, academics, student bodies, often working separately. So what might it mean to work together more? And there's, as has been mentioned in the other events as well, there's a lot of affective labor that leads to depletion. And we also need to find where the joy is in this as well, something that we lose a lot, and something that I've been discussing more and more recently, joy as a kind of form of resistance in itself. And I've been discussing this with colleagues more and more. We can't only be focused on the kind of pragmatic paths or actions, but to understand the affective labor of calling out when some of this work is being used in superficial ways. So when intersectionality is invoked or decoloniality is invoked, how do we push at the kind of depth in which those terms are being used in our universities? And there's plenty of kind of intellectual resources to help us to do that. And this might help us, I think, move forward in different ways. So an important area within this is how we build kind of longer lasting solidarities, not just focused on particular individuals. And I think this might connect to what Mia will say next. So structured solidarity action and political allyship is really important. In terms of the structures of universities, too often we hear stories of defunding and restructuring DEI functions that make meaningful institutional work much harder. And so this involves asking university management what they're willing to commit, but also what they're willing to sacrifice, rather than cutting DEI work when times get hard. And I think there's also a potential to work across solidarities. So, for example, sustainability managers or the sustainability function in universities and their roles face many of the same challenges that we do as equity practitioners. So how might we build those together to push the dial along? So the importance of solidarity is that it becomes the shared responsibility with and for the lives of others, one that can be based on a sense of shared care and intimacy. So really focusing, I guess, on solidarity that binds our endeavours, but is constantly challenged by the neoliberal regimes that attempt to individualise our experience and atomise our experience. And I think many of us might agree that the most powerful modes of solidarity are based not on shared identity, but are driven by affect, by the rage and passion and a desire for connection and change. And sometimes this involves wearing different hats or working across the different identities that we might find ourselves in, and unsettling structures through those means rather than through the kind of categories of difference that universities often would pigeonhole ourselves as. And I guess sometimes these spaces of solidarity can feel really vibrant and energizing, but as we know all too painfully, they can also be closed down. So what that affective solidarity is and the struggles that come with it, I think, involve imagining feminist futures. And so that's the third kind of issue I want to bring up, is really thinking about how we push our horizons of possibilities, how we imagine differently, and reflecting on that horizon of imagination is also limited. And we sometimes come up against the limits of imagination in our universities ourselves, in the management structures, and what we can aspire to work on. So how do we imagine beyond what currently feels possible? How does this help us move forward? And what kind of futures might we strive for to keep hopeful within doing kind of meaningful DEI work? And this links to how we might use some of the work done on sort of speculative futures and critical utopias, a kind of, an intellectualized way of saying, how do we imagine differently? And it's something that some of the academic feminist communities I'm part of have started to think about and explore, is how do we progress and process equity work is in part connected to how we might create hopeful futures through maybe a more utopian vision rather than feeling subjected to a future that is already laid out. And so I think some of the work in critical utopias asks a rather impractical but nonetheless important question. What do we need to build to achieve a yet to be imagined future? And I think this might kind of connect to Mira and Mia's point, talks around unlearning and relearning some of the practices that we find ourselves in equity work, but getting university managers or functions that decide what kind of DEI work gets done, asking them to think beyond the narrow structures and institutionalized habits that they find themselves in. So sometimes, we are, Bontu mentioned the minority tax, we are suddenly made responsible in Wendy Brown's terms. There's a process of responsibilization for the people who are the most affected to then do the labor to bring themselves out of discrimination. And I guess that there is also a chance to hand over to those who aren't sometimes part of the difficult work to help us to build those sustainable communities. And so I guess there's really pushing ourselves to think about, or freeing ourselves to think from existing ways and practices. And that is a process. It is a set of practices. You don't just create new imaginaries kind of out of nowhere. So what is it what kind of reflexive dialogues can we have that might help create the conditions, practices, and environments we want to see in anti-racist and anti-sexist universities? And we can always sometimes criticize more utopian thinking as too idealistic or unachievable or really only benefiting a select few. But certainly the more critical approaches to thinking in this way really take that seriously, and I think could be a really interesting and rich way of understanding more inclusive futures. I've realized I've gone over time, so I'll stop there, but thanks for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sheena. And thank you for already opening these perspectives on how can we imagine futures for organizing differently? What could that actually look like? What would be needed to commit to this work? I think that's extremely important. Thanks a lot. And again, looking forward to coming back to this in the discussion. Before we get there, let me introduce our third speaker for today. That is Mira Plotnikof. As I already mentioned earlier, Mira was really at the forefront of the Me Too movement in Danish academia. She co-organized the sexism petition that was circulated in Danish higher education in the fall of 2020 and ended up gathering testimonials from 689 researchers describing experiences of sexual harassment and discrimination in Danish higher education. She is a co-founder of the award-winning initiative Sexism Edu, which includes a handbook on sexism in higher education and how to deal with it, and also a really cool podcast called Do You Know Sexism? Mira is associate professor at the Danish School of Education at Aarhus University, and her research questions the performativity and micropolitics of dominant discourses, norms of difference, and power resistance dynamics. It's through critical approaches that she explores how such issues emerge and shape everyday life, with a specific focus on normative effects on subjectivity, practices, and conditions of possibility, whether that is in educational, organizational, or policy contexts. And I think kind of bringing both of that together, the research and then also the feminist solidarity work, if I can call it that, I think for me really makes me a role model of what a feminist researcher is, or what a feminist researcher can be and can look like, committed to the feminist work in research and in practice. And I think you will probably touch upon different aspects around that today, around that feminist work in academia. So without further ado, Mira, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bantu, and I just want to give it back. You are also a role model to me, and actually all of you are. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I am a little bit ill, so I hope you can hear me, and I'm sorry if I have to just sneeze once in a while. I actually decided to do some slides, so I think I will try to share my screen if that's okay. Let's just see if this works. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for organizing these important webinars, and of course for inviting me as well to join it. I think it is so important that we keep on having these discussions, because if we don't, we will suddenly lose sight, or we will simply lose sight of what is really important. And I think that also refers directly to both what Mira and Sheena has been saying, that this is an ongoing work. We cannot do it and decide to do it and then it's fixed, or we cannot imagine a future and then expect it to come. This is ongoing work, and this is also why I have focused my talk here about this difficult labor, as I call it. So what I'm going to talk about is the non-performativity of anti-discrimination in Danish higher education, on the difficult labor of both formal and informal politics and practices. And I will shortly highlight 3 points that I think are really relevant for us to further discuss the future of anti-discrimination in higher education. And they are about the non-performativity of anti-discriminatory policies. They are about the performativity of both formal structures and cultures, as well, and more informal aspects. And then they're about the future demands, which I think are really about what Mira also said about pushing beyond this romantic national discourse of equality that is really, really dominant. And in a Danish context, the Nordic equality paradox on exceptionalism, as Mira just told us about, are really crucial reminders that while all policies are in place, for example, equality acts, equity acts, equal pay acts, and so forth, the anti-discriminatory efforts remain challenging to assure in practice, both in terms of the formal structures and procedures, for example, how we handle cases, how we deal with salaries, although they look like they should be easy to handle, they're actually not, how we secure equality in recruitment and promotion tracks. All of these formal structures are actually more challenging than we tend to think so. Furthermore, the informal relations and cultures are also quite challenging in terms of everyday discrimination, prejudice, biases, accessibility to power positions, and even networks. So in many ways, the Nordic equality paradox and exceptionalism remains a puzzle, and as such a great challenge to scholars, policy actors, practitioners, and everyone who's really concerned with anti-discrimination and, of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think if we are to kind of think further of how to understand, but also not just understand it, but really enable ourselves to act on it, we can actually get a lot of inspiration from some of the scholars who's been working on this for a long time, and we've already been mentioning Sarah Ahmed, but I also think Butler can help us here. Standing on both Judith Butler and Sarah Ahmed's shoulder, I think we can look at Nordic equality paradox and Nordic exceptionalism as non-performative acts of anti-discrimination policies in Danish higher education, but of course also beyond. And just to help us understand a little bit, I just want to kind of reiterate what Butler explains performativity as. And Butler says performativity is a reiterative and citational practice by which discourse produces the effects that it names. And then Ahmed later adds that non-performativity is an act that works precisely by not bringing about the effects that they name. So following this, we are painfully reminded that these taken for granted points include anti-discriminatory discourses in policy, in HR, and DEI efforts only become performative insofar as we, and I mean we as the big we, all of us practice and act, materialize them every day in and out of whatever activities we are involved in. So this is really the reiteration. We all need to do it, no matter where we are, but of course, especially if we're in a position of power. Furthermore, we really need to pay much more attention, and I think really like critical attention to efforts that claim action, but actually does not produce conditions of possibility to perform it. So one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is that there's a lot of willfulness in universities to really act on this by putting down councils, by making new reports, by discussing step-by-step guides of how to deal with it. But what about resources to actually do something about it? What about prioritizing the knowledge base for understanding further the complexities around this? So we really need to push even further to not just think that any action is good action, but really make sure that the actions that are offered can actually become performative, so they won't become non-performatives that legitimize non-action, non-speakability, and non-critique. I think especially this latter part is really important because the formalities and informalities really reinforce each other. And that's why we need to really work on both the formal sides, so the structural aspects, but indeed also all the informal situations where we are in. Even if it's just about humor or a discussion culture, we really need to dare at this point to name the problem and give the problem a name, even if it puts ourselves in a discomforting place or it puts ourselves at risk. I think this is where we are at. Yeah. And I think after the past year's focus on sexism and racism, we've seen a challenge of this romantic national discourse about equality, and it's become more and more legitimate to actually say we have issues and we need to deal with them. And we can see at Danish universities, there's a more focus on the need for formal efforts to insist on acting beyond policies, for example, DI councils, employment structures. And some of these practices include leadership training, recruitment committees, diversity and curriculum demands, non-tenure support networks to move the responsibility from the individual to organizational and structural levels. We are seeing some of these developments. We are also beginning to understand that the needs for cultural efforts to dare in acting and manifesting anti-discriminatory values in daily life, including how people in positions of power and privilege must be more clear and active in explicitly talking about discrimination, problems, raising discussions, and countering, or even, as Sarah Ahmed says, killjoying when gray areas emerge. This is really, really important. And this includes daring to discuss what kind of humor is acceptable, specific research environment traditions, debate cultures, or the way that we use a critical tone. We are at a place where we really need to dare to take up these discussions. And this is, of course, especially important if you are in a position of power, formal power, but also informal power. And some of the informal practices that we're seeing becoming used in some universities, at least, are cultural teamwork building, role plays, grassroots networks, but we are also still seeing this reproduction of shadow organizing to prevent harassment, and even maybe excluding actors who are known to have microaggressive or offensive behavior. So as long as the structural side doesn't fix the problem, there will be informal ways of organizing around it. And in some ways that can sound like a good thing, but actually when we fix the problem in the shadows, so to speak, we also enable the reproduction of the problem, because the structural solutions to actually make impossible the issues with discrimination will never be developed. This focus on both the formal and informal efforts, however, is still dependent on being prioritized at the university, the faculty, department, and research group level. And this means that the development and the standardization of procedures, the new solutions and cultural changes remain localized and often individual responsibility. This also means that risks of non-performative acts of anti-discrimination are higher. So to assure that we do not reproduce chances of this non-performativity, then we need to really push much harder on thinking across both the formal and informal efforts, with all the difficult labor that involves for all of us. And I think in these times, I really mean all of us, no matter where we are in the system, and even no matter if we feel like we're implicated ourselves, or if we don't feel like we know or don't know so much about it. This is a battle we all need to fight, because the push back and the push to regression is so hard at the moment. And this brings me to my final point of how to do this. And I think, Sheena, you said some beautiful things about thinking about feminist futures. And I've really gone back to some of the classics here. So I went back to Butler, who says, performativity describes this relation of being implicated in that which one opposes. This turning of power against itself to produce alternative modalities of power, to establish a kind of political contestation that is not a pure opposition or a transcendence of contemporary relations of power, but a difficult labor of forging a future from resources inevitably impure. And I think this difficult labor, I really think we should take that seriously and actually really think about the difficulties in it, both when we're trying to see new solutions that we can't even begin to imagine, but also all the tough, hard labor in the daily reiteration of anti-discrimination. So this difficult labor of forging a future, I think involves both formal structures and really making sure that all policies and procedures are in place and that we keep on developing them, because those are the ones that keep on legitimizing this as an agenda. But then we also need to do all the informal stuff. And I think here both of you have touched upon the need for us to think of this in solidary ways and really to organize it, because doing informal work is very, very tough on single individuals, and it shouldn't be this way. I think doing both and demands careful persistence and insistence from all of us. And I think it's also much more complex and demanding than just one of them. And this is also why we need to think in solidarities and really think in collectives, because we cannot do it all at once, of course. And some of the things that I myself have seen as good examples of how to really work in these double modes, so to speak. And I've also seen this outside of the university, but also within the university, as ways to help us remind us what can we do, are both norm critique and responsibility. And I'm going to end with these two ideas of how to kind of find ways to be in this and try to both see the formal issues and the informal aspects of where we can push further. And norm critique offers a deconstructive and reformulating analytics and methods to see norms at work and consider their potential discrimination, hence to help attend to both formal and informal aspects of anti-discriminatory work. Responsibility involves a micro-political concern with taking responsibility for both preventing and responding ethically to discriminatory encounters when those encounters occur. So this is really an in situ sensitivity of how to dare speak about the problem when it occurs. Not only if it's us who's being involved in the problem, but also when we're witnessing it. And I think these two approaches are really, really important to deal with the daily difficult labor of anti-discriminatory work, but also to question how the formal structures are keeping in place what it is keeping in place, but maybe also when they need to evolve. And then especially also relating to Sheena's point about feminist futures, how to think about a future we don't even know can exist yet. Yeah, so these were really my quick points, and I'm looking very much forward to discuss all of this further with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mia. Thank you for these super important points around both kind of formal and informal efforts for equality. I think also already linking, as you were saying, has helped to a lot of Mira's and Sheena's points. And I think also a really good starting point for our discussion that we're going to enter into now. As a reminder for our audience, you're super welcome to contribute with your questions or comments by using the Q&A function, and Molly will collect these and we will then bring them in. But I would actually like to start with a question that I think picks up on your input, Mia, but also I think connects to what you shared in the beginning, Mira, because Mira, you were speaking about the need for more competencies and knowledge about inequalities, about how inequalities work, about anti-discrimination. And as I understand you now, Mia, you're kind of similar or relatedly kind of saying or arguing that we need that knowledge anchored within formal structures of higher education. Now, one of the issues that we discussed quite a lot in this webinar series is how to do anti-discrimination work that pays attention to more than one aspect of inequality. So how to do gender equality work that also pays attention to queerphobia and transphobia, how to do DI work that it explicitly addresses racism, how to do feminist work that talks about ableism, etc. And relating this to this claim for more knowledge. How do we make sure that this knowledge then doesn't just reproduce one quote unquote dominant DEI or equality discourse, but actually stays open to the plurality of different perspectives that are important here, but at the same time becomes this kind of general connecting, maybe even institutionalized or formalized knowledge. And maybe I'll start with you, Mira, if that's okay, and then we'll just pass it on.
So I'm hearing the question as how can we, or as for me, when I hear your question, I think, well, how hard could that be? Because as I see it, discrimination is inherently, it is intersectional. You can't think about, I can't, at least I must be, I don't know how to think about it without thinking about it as all of the discrimination grounds. But remember, my work is grounded in the human rights framework. And that means that there is a very, very clearly defined group of protected categories or protected groups that all are included under this notion of non-discrimination, under this concept, and in our laws. And you're right, on the one hand, that legally we have traditionally done this single axis approach where we've thought, well, either it's gender or it's in disability. But if you look at humans, that's not a thing. There's no such thing as a free-floating gender or a free-floating ability. We are always all of those things. So what we have to do is unlearn what we have learned and relearn, I think, what discrimination means and what it's talking about, because we're talking about how power is imbricated in the body or in the subject, and that there's no two subjects that are going to be equally are going to be meeting discrimination in the same ways because of the way in which we are all this complex. So what does this mean? So the question, I don't know if I'm getting really hairy now, but my answer would be that if we have genuine knowledge around discrimination and anti-discrimination and racism and gender, if we really understand those concepts, well, we wouldn't necessarily, then we would be able to better embrace the complexity of those identities. The problem isn't the lack of knowledge. Sometimes it's the inability to embrace complexity because we've all been taught that is simplicity, easy answers, simple categories, and the effective way to work. So thinking in one category becomes the easy way out, but it's not the knowledgeable way out. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Mia, is there something you want to add to that maybe?
Yeah, I think actually, well, it links directly to what Mira says and what you said yourself, Bonsu. I think we can argue that we need to knowledge base the way that we work with it. And if new economic models would be developed, then we would also expect the organization to bring them in and implement it into the work practices. So this is exactly the same. We have lots of emerging frameworks that are thoroughly working in intersectional perspectives. Of course, we need to, and we should be able to expect that the organization will also include that in the future ways of working with those issues. So I think this is really also a place or a situation where we need to push back and say, this is a knowledge area. We have clear knowledge on this area. We even have theories and actually also quite actionable frameworks that show how to deal with this and how to explore these intersectional matters. So we expect that to be the base of this kind of work. So I think this is also where we can kind of help point to the knowledge that can help us inform the structural work, but of course also all the informal work that we do ourselves or that we sometimes are involved in at least.
Can I just add one thing, or should we go further?
Go ahead.
I was just thinking that one of the things we might want to keep in mind when we're talking about this is also that there's a sustainability framework, the ESG framework, this whole framework around how to do social sustainability, which until fairly recently has just been sort of a free-floating, make it up as you go along thing. It's been very, very clearly defined now for European organizations and companies, and that's going to trickle down. And that means we suddenly have a framework in which sustainability and DEI are no longer two different areas, but this whole way to understand it and define non-discrimination has become very important to how we do social sustainability. So we also have this framework, which might be a way in which to approach the operationalization of this. Just wanted to bring that in.
Yeah, so and I'll come to you, or Sheena, please go ahead, and then I'll come in.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that because you've really made me think also about how this connects to the will to change.
Yeah.
You know, we can say this knowledge exists, we can say the frameworks are there, but what foregrounds the learning is the kind of political impetus or the will to move these, create this, have the wheels in motion to get to a better place. And that political will is the thing that I think we sometimes might struggle with. Or there's no shortage of good intention, but then there's little being put forward in terms of commitment of resources or sacrifice of what do universities let go in order to build time, money, and effort into these. And I guess that, there's a real connection that needs to be made between the existence of the knowledge and then the desire to have that developed.
Which relates, I think, also to this point you were just making, Mira, of it needs to be an unlearning and a relearning. So we need this step of unlearning first in a way to let go of what we expect this kind of knowledge to look like, that we expect it to be easy solutions, single-sided approaches, and understanding that maybe that is part of the sacrifice of letting go of that kind of idea of what it might look like, and then being open to that plurality being open to bearing the weight of differences. I think Sheena was phrasing it also in her talk as an important first step. And I'm also thinking then, a related question, I guess, to that is who is part of organizing that process of relearning and learning, and who is then bringing that knowledge to the table, so to speak. The Weaver report shows quite clearly that discrimination is an issue for many people, but there are groups that are at a higher risk of being discriminated against, people in precarious positions, junior scholars, but also, as the report shows, bisexual women, women not born in Denmark, etc. So it also makes me think about this question, who is actually part of creating this knowledge, who has a voice in these discussions, whose perspectives are being valued. As you were sharing also, Sheena, about the politics of different experiences, how some voices are kind of always already politicized differently than others. So I guess my question is, who is currently missing in the equality and anti-discrimination work, and how do we make sure that these perspectives are brought in and that they actually have a say? Is that through DEI councils? Is that through self-organized work? Is that in the formal structures? Do we have to let go of that categorization? And we use every way possible, but maybe I can start with you, Sheena, because you started already talking about this. How do we make sure that then a variety of perspectives is actually represented and listened to, and what is hindering us from achieving that so far?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Who is excluded? And I think it's probably too many to mention, right? There are those kind of protected in the UK, equality language, protected characteristics, but within that is the messiness inside those categories of difference, and then all those dimensions of difference that we probably don't readily talk about or invoke day to day. But I think for me, when Mia was talking about kind of informal and informal, it really struck me that, it struck me that then opens us out to a whole range of politics around what grassroots movements can do, that when they're not institutionalized in formal structures. And we talk about structural systemic change, but then we also, I think, have to talk about spaces of resistance that are exempt from those structures and architectures that have historically, certainly for feminist progress, been incredibly important. And I think that we have to have that combination, but also recognizing that paradox that, pushing more and more into informal spaces means that existing structures don't get critically pushed at, or their boundaries don't get pushed at. So I think that for me, there's a lot of reflexive work that we need to do outside of, in feminist communities or in anti-racist movements, that then can in some ways trickle into universities, and that, almost having spaces that feel more politically agile and less institutionalized. And that for me, certainly in the UK, we've had equality legislation since the 1970s, yet we don't see the progress that we would expect from having that very important intervention. And that's a very reductive way of saying we need multiple varied strategies here. So I don't know if the answers are councils. I guess that is one way, but I find the DEI architecture, certainly in UK higher education, very challenging to engage with for meaningful change, because there is so much instrumentalization. Let's market the equalities we have rather than focusing on the inequality. So we get pay gap reporting, but what happens on the basis of that in terms of meaningful change is really difficult. So that was a very rambling answer to, I think we need every avenue in and every avenue out.
Can I just briefly follow up on that? Because I think that is also always very interesting to kind of learn from other contexts how that work is being done there, what works, what doesn't work. And as I hear you, it's maybe also a bit of an issue of there is formal work happening, there's informal work happening, but it doesn't always connect in a way that actually leads to change. So could you say a bit more about that from the UK perspective on where this work maybe moves in different directions or doesn't come together, or maybe also positive examples of where it does work better?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have as many positive examples as I would like, but certainly I think the more informal work sometimes gets either ignored by the formal structures or subsumed into then a new instrumental narrative or how it's marketized by the university. So yeah, I think it's a really good, in terms of the challenges, I see DEI functions that have their internal dynamics and don't always have a good relation with other forms of activism and resistance happening in academic communities or student communities. And so I think the ways in which university like management functions interact with student communities is not as not as mutually beneficial as I guess it could be. And certainly as a feminist academic in a university where you see persistent increasing inequalities is really difficult. And it makes me much more questioning of formal routes to anti-discrimination. What that means for activism sort of from a more oblique external, how does that then enter the university? I think that I'm struggling to think of sort of positive examples, but I can see some real potential to happen, certainly in the UK context.
Thank you. And I would be curious, actually, Mia and Mira, how you see that in the Danish context. Do you see potential or maybe even also positive examples of where this more like formal and informal work coming together can be a way of broadening the perspectives, bringing in voices that otherwise maybe wouldn't have a space in the formal structures of higher education? Or do you see similar issues of having, as Mia was also saying, non-performative diversity work on a formal level, and then maybe work that tries to push and also push against this narrative of we've already arrived, we already have equality, etc., but on a rather informal level and thereby more easily, as you were also saying, Mira, labeled as not really knowledge or just an opinion or something like that. I'd be curious to hear how you see that here in Denmark.
I'm in a way very disappointed to hear that it's not much better than the UK because there's been a much more explicit and practical application, and I've looked to the UK for much of the research we also now are drawing on in the Danish context, so that's a little bit sad. But of course, there's always the geopolitical and the political different things that also play into this. In the Danish context, we can still hide a little tiny bit behind the fact that we simply really actually genuinely don't have much qualified academic knowledge around these things that people have been used to using. It's been there. It's been around for hundreds of years. It's not that, but it's like it hasn't been a part. So that's a little part of it. Good examples I do see, actually, weirdly enough, in the student organization some years back at the University of Copenhagen did create quite an attention getting around the fact that there was discriminatory curriculum and there were problems in different departments, certainly in terms of gender and race, and I believe also in disability. And that pushback, even though it became a conflict, and the student organization that did this created put themselves in a terrible position, and some of them will today not get hired for a PhD because of what they did. So the repercussions for this minoritized group of students became a taxation. However, we did see that this did create some waves, and we did see that university start thinking in a different way and trying to prioritize, but still fumbling because they just didn't. I mean, the UK is still way ahead, which is distressing because of that. So so you can see like little bits here and there. And there's another university where you see a very active, institutionalized practice trying to get people working with the diversity framework and doing some monitoring within the different departments. I have a lot of critique of the way that they're doing it, but it is something. So we're seeing little movements that are both informal and formal, at least in this case, formalized. And I've just been invited into that work, and we'll have to see if how I told them I'm going to be coming in critically, but what is it working? Is it not working? What are they actually doing? So somehow this discussion over the last 5-7 years had, at the informal, at the political, at the activist level, has done something for some areas. What it actually means in practice, especially in the current political situation, that will be interesting to see. I don't know. But I mean, like you were saying, I think Sheena or me, I don't even remember which one of you said it, but we can't live without the informal processes. We can't live without the activisms and the different movements, because without them, we wouldn't have anything. We'd still have no voting rights as women. So these things have to work together. So I like the idea of somehow thinking critically about how we're thinking things and inviting people that we're not comfortable with into those conversations as powered groups. And I think it's extremely, extremely important when we're working with this, that we really open up to being introspective and critical of the work we're doing, just regardless of what a great hat we are and what one we're wearing and how we would love diversity. Who's doing that diversity work, as everyone's saying, right? Who are we in that? Is it just a bunch of majoritized women that are now taking that, and at some level taking that platform? So now that's an almost a new form of colonialism or exploitation, which is dangerous because it's not thinking intersectionally at all if you do that. It's just it's a different kind of dynamic. So this whole critical intersectional willingness to look at what we're actually doing is needed, and I think that's needed very much at the formal level. At the informal level, we also kind of need it, I'd have to say. So I don't know how to answer your question. I'm sorry.
But I think that was some really important points, and it links back also to the question of how do we make sure that this knowledge is not just the dominant discourse and not just from the dominant perspective, even within the DI work. I think it's exactly that point of being consistently self-critical, as you were just saying, inviting people in who maybe make us uncomfortable or challenge us, but that's what we need to do consistently.
And can I just say one thing? I know we're all very upset about the American situation and what they're saying and all of that, but in some strange little way, it's also really important to take that critique to us. What has been going on in this DEI conversation? How much of it has been diversity industrial complex? How much of it has been diversity washing? How much of it has been genuine? Maybe this really awful situation forces us to think more critically about what this field is. How is it situated in knowledge? In which ways is it a reproduction of power? In which ways is it not? When is it elitist? Because I think as much as I find it upsetting and worrying, I'm actually not that worried. I think it's interesting. What will this do to the conversation? Will we become open to more critically assessing what we're doing? I don't agree. I'm just thinking that we could use this as an opportunity, I think. That's what I was going to say.
And Mia, maybe I can pass this on to you and also add a little bit to it, because you were also already mentioning kind of what are then the different formalized ways within higher education institutions of where DI work is happening, could happen. And I would like to go a bit more in that direction of trying to be quite concrete on what could work how, also knowing that in our audience we have quite a wide variety or diversity of people working in different positions across higher education. So I'm thinking starting maybe with this organizational level, if we have people working in HR, people working in DI boards, maybe people working also in law or legal positions within universities, how can they be part of creating that push towards equality and anti-discrimination from these organizational positions? Which challenges might there be, but also what should be prioritized, because it really makes a difference.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to start by saying that I think they are already doing it. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. When we talk about it, it can sound like people do not want to do it. But I do think that we've seen lots of changes the past 5-7-ish years. And one of the main changes or shifts that I have at least seen as a very tangible thing is that this has become a legitimate issue. So we can actually raise discriminatory issues and expect to be heard. And I think this is a shift that is super, super important. So that's one thing that I want to mention. And I think this is really thanks to a lot of these people working from those different organizational positions. The other shift that I want to attend to is that 5-10 years ago, this was often referred to as opinion-based discussions. And now more and more people know those are knowledge-based discussions, and especially people that are sitting in HR functions or in different councils know that there will be knowledge to be informed by. So this kind of this way of thinking about these issues as we need to know more about it in order for us to think of what to do. I think this is also really key, and I think we should think of it much more like we do with everything else. If there's a budget issue, we will think about the best ways to think about budgets, or the newest ways, or the best practices, or next practices, or whatever. It's a bit the same. Of course, we don't have simple, easy ways of fixing stuff when it's about discrimination, but we still have lots of knowledge. So I think this is also something that is being done already. I have experienced this quite a lot the past 5 years, been invited to give small talks or to refer people to literature. And I think this is really also a gesture of the formalizing structures to be more mature in a way to push themselves forward. And I think this is the responsibility that people who work with those who are positioned in those kinds of work areas, that they also need to make sure that if we don't know how to deal with it, we need to figure out how to get more informed. So there's this upskilling, and I'm saying it in this way because upskilling can, of course, both be formalized. We need to upskill everyone around the newest policies or anti-discriminatory efforts and so on, but it can also be on a case-to-case basis. And I think we need to think of it in both ways, actually. And then there's the last thing that I want to kind of touch upon in this discussion, and that is because you started asking who are we missing, or which voices might not be represented in these both formal and informal groups, but maybe especially in the formalized groups. And I think this is really one of the biggest challenges, because at least my experience has been the past 5 years after the sexism petition, that those people, the experiences we really need to learn from, those are the people who are actually trying to hide because they don't want to become a problem. They have never tried to be in a position where they experience those issues. So there's really a dilemma built in here that we need knowledge from people who are already extremely vulnerable. And this is one of the areas where I'm really thinking that everyone who's working with DEI somehow, either as practitioners, as activists, or as researchers, we have an extra responsibility to somehow sensitize ourselves to those vulnerable positions without outing them. And I don't know, I have no idea how to do this, especially I'm thinking also, Mira, with one of the things that you said, without being or taking on this normative, better knowing, kind of arrogant position. I really, that's not what I'm advocating, but somehow we need to sensitize ourselves to the stories that are silencing themselves to not be put in a vulnerable positions or in a more vulnerable position than they already are. And this is really one of the kind of challenges that I think we're facing to move beyond white feminism, to move beyond this white savior complex, if we're talking in that context. And I'm really unsure how to do it. And I don't see examples from the system of how to do it. But of course, we have representatives from different positions in councils, for example. But I don't think that's not the point here. The point is it's those vulnerable experiences that are so vulnerable that they're trying to stay in the shade, so to speak. But we need somehow to learn from them still.
Did you want to jump right in on that, Mira? Please feel free.
I always want to jump right in on it.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure if I'm supposed to. Yeah, because I was thinking about it in a slightly different way, because I immediately started thinking about how we do teaching and how we have this, we're a university. We automatically already are exclusive and elitist. And we already, if you just look at our groups of students or the people who are working there, who's missing? That's a good place to start. Who's not there? Who's not represented? That's not rocket science. So already there we can see, just by, if we were just to use a simple analysis, like an impact analysis that you see in the human rights framework, you look at each protected group, look at the space in which you're assessing, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. This group seems to be very, I mean, I know these groups aren't closed in essential groups, but there seems to be a low representation of people with particular types of disability, or people with a particular class, social class background, or a so forth and so forth, that we can look at that, or different racial backgrounds, or it seems like everyone here is quite sort of are light-skinned, or whatever it is. So it's not that hard to look at who's here, who's not here, who's missing, if we were to do it that way. But it's also how we do our institutions, how we do our practices, how we do our meeting structures, how we do our teaching practices, how we invite students to participate, in which ways, who can even, and we've been talking about this for years, so it's nothing new, really. So there's all of these different ways in which we can invite without speaking for, speaking on behalf of, or presuming about individuals that they may or may not be vulnerable in different ways. So there's all of that, and that's but that's maybe my hat. I always go back to, well, how are we understanding these concepts? How are we understanding ourselves in these rooms? And how am I able to stay vigilant about my own knowledge position, my extremely privileged position, on top of that now, as a parent and as a grandparent, this like knowing better thing, I think a lot of this work is actually, as much as I say it's collective and it's structural and it's institutional, it's also very much our own introspective work and facing ourselves, looking at ourselves in the mirror, which has been not always fun, definitely not always fun, because we're just as much as I'm criticizing all of us for wanting to be the good and what are we doing ourselves? Why are we even in this field? So there's a lot of that in it. Yeah, I think those are the kinds of questions. So how do you do that work? Oh, by making a lot of mistakes along the way, I think. And I think maybe of being able to live with that and to be able to apologize in that process when we do step on toes, because there's just no way around not stepping on toes. But then you go back to this discussion, well, if I'm going to step on toes, if I'm not going to be perfect at this, well, then I'm not going to do it. That's not going to work either. And that's something about having to give up the privilege of being right as academics, as people in these positions of power and privilege, giving up the right to be right, I guess, or that entitlement that we have, because you actually really do have to play with your own power. You have to give something up if you're going to do this. And I don't think that you have to give something up for someone else to get there. I don't believe that there's like a finite amount of anything. But I do think that we have to look more critically at ourselves in order to get past that. And it's not always fun to look at yourself as the savior or whatever it is, but we're all doing it. Maybe that's a good place to look. But then we also have to look at how the institution is doing it. Yeah.
One position or one role, or Sheena, do you want to comment first, and then I take it on that? One position that I was just thinking about also in relation to this, where I think we have exactly that paradox of where we would need that kind of care and reflectiveness, and how do I bring people in? How do I do this work? And on the other hand, this idea of I need to know it all, I need to already be perfect at it, is also in leadership positions and leadership around universities, where I know that Sheena, you also work on that. So maybe it relates to what you were going to say. Otherwise, feel free to bring in both points. And also, Mia, you were starting to talk about responsible work and leadership. So I was also just thinking, if people are in positions of leadership within higher education, that can be in all kinds of different levels. How that, or what the role of that leadership could also be in equity work, of letting go of that idea of I need to know how it all works and I need to talk from this kind of dominant normative position, to rather a questioning of norms, a questioning reflection on one's own role, seeing that more as a caring kind of work of bringing different perspectives in, etc. But Sheena, I'll pass to you also for the point you wanted to mention.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be quick. I think that it's such an important point around the fear and anxiety that many people have doing this type of work. It's both, as Mira was saying, deeply introspective and reflexive, or it could be collectively reflexive. But especially if we talk about, as a kind of case example, our ability to discuss race is fraught with huge kind of challenges in terms of language. I mean, we just had mandatory acceptable behavior training from in our school, and it started with, don't worry, nothing's gone hugely wrong. We just want everyone to be like on the same page. But of course, the language that's used in these rooms doesn't always lean towards the kind of reflexive, embodied, maybe vulnerable kind of spaces that we sometimes need in order to progress or move forward in terms of the discussions we have. And it also brings up this kind of relationship between expert knowledge and experiential knowledge, that we are, our lived experiences, our embodied experiences are, we spend our time sometimes masking some of those and sometimes exposing our individual experiences, and that it also intersects with the kind of role of expertise that we are given, and that we will use ourselves, as Mira was saying. So I think that there's something like, how do we tackle the anxiety of DEI work, both from all of us who question ourselves every day, but then there are plenty of people who don't even think in these terms, or, what is our role to then be able to open up conversations with them. And I think that's the challenge. I mean, that's where kind of society meets organizations and institutions. And I see one of the questions that someone's raised is around, the impossibility of even invoking terms like feminist when there is an increasingly hostile environment to using politicized language around equality. But I would also agree with Mira's point around how, as horrific as the now probably global attacks on DEI work are, and partly as a result of far-right populism that has seen sort of gender conversations around gender attacked as well, then actually it does open up critical conversations. If we move beyond outrage, what does it do to our communities? And that could be a source of potential change or social, of transformation, where we aren't simply moving between sort of feeling sometimes disenchanted with some of these policies and practices because they're not doing enough, and then trying to create new politics. It maybe opens up conversations. But yeah, I'll leave it there actually.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting that both of you mentioned that, because I think often when you feel like your field is under attack, there's this intuitive reaction to kind of closing down and defending it. And I think it's very interesting that both of you are rather saying, well, if we get beyond that state of maybe outrage or wanting to defend and needing to defend also to some degree, how can we also use it as an opening to challenge ourselves and discuss more? I want to make sure that we also come to the questions in the chat. So maybe I'll bring in my question around leadership in through the Q&A, or bring it back in later if we have time. But Molly, should we have a look at what we have in the Q&A from the audience?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ponto, and thank you to Sheena, Mira, and me for all of your really great and interesting insights. We have quite a few questions coming in the chat. So I want to frame the first one kind of like picking up from some of the earlier discussions about the complexity in DEI work, and kind of the visibility, invisibility, kind of like some of these themes that we were already picking up on. There was a question about how that sometimes racism can be experienced in non-typical ways. And there's, for example, linguistic and cultural racism towards different communities. And so how can we address different forms of racism? Some of this maybe also tie into xenophobia, and then, all of these different kinds of racism, the structural, linguistic, cultural, benevolent, and then some of, the more violent forms of racism. How do we address these kind of things in DEI work when some people are subjected to some of these forms in different ways or disproportionately than others that are also facing racism or xenophobia? Maybe Mira, since you were kind of talking about that earlier, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I was just writing one down actually, because I was thinking that it really does connect to some of the citations or the quotations, both from Ahmed and from Butler, which in practice means when these, first of all, I would take up that when it's if it's a German language or if it's a different language, if it's linguistic, it would be discrimination, not racism. But let's not, it's just so we make it clear that racism has some particular groups and discrimination is broader. However, discrimination you need to know that could be a form of discrimination to take it up as discrimination, but naming and bringing these also atypical forms of discrimination into a conversation, looking at them, naming it, understanding it, addressing it. I think I'm sort of the pragmatic approach to that, I think is mine, is that we've got to name the different assorted elephants in the room. And we've got to address them, and we've got to try to understand what are the dynamics. So if we learn enough about discrimination, we can also learn to identify when is something discrimination, in which ways, which power axes are in play here. Would you consider this group a protected group? How is that impacting their ability to participate in social, cultural, and academic practice and so forth? So naming it, addressing it, and looking at it, and having the uncomfortable conversation would be my take on that. And to do that, you do have to learn how to have the uncomfortable. It requires a step before you take that step. You need to be trained or have thought about or have had some kind of practice or considered at least that it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. So how do I react in an uncomfortable situation? In which ways how am I met? How am I read? How do I read people? How do I act in that situation in order to make that conversation possible and empathetic and with care and caring? So I'm not really sure what the answer is, other than the first step has to be, how are we even going to have this conversation? What do I need to be thinking about in order to have such a difficult conversation? And the next is, what are we actually talking about? What name can I give this? And how can we talk about this in a respectful way where I'm not outfying. I'm not finding the word in English.
Ignoring way.
The experience. So maybe the word I'm thinking about here is also validation. And we know from research that validation has extremely is just a very pragmatic and a very effective way to acknowledge people's experience without having to say, I know better, or it's just saying, yes, your experience is real. It may not be my experience. It's real. So how can we talk about it? So this validation is a good tool in that uncomfortable conversation. Yeah, I think that's, I hope that made made any sense there, actually.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mira. Sheena and me, do you have any thoughts on the question?
Do you want to go?
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to mention that the point I ended up raising with responsibility is exactly this. It's developing the capability or the capacity to take responsibility to respond when you encounter these moments, but without prior to that thinking that you know the solution and that there necessarily will be an easy solution, but that you know how to respond to it in a caringly and ethically responsible way. And I think this is really where at least I'm seeing with the formal leaders, the managers, but also practitioners that I'm working with, this is where we are at the moment, how to develop that capacity. And of course, that's super important if you are in a formal position, but it's of course also very important for the rest of us. And I think this is, so I have a new research project coming up that's exactly about that, because that will be full of discomfort. It will be effective labor. It will also be power infused. So figuring out how to build the capacity of being in those situations, taking the responsibility to responding in ethically considerate and caring ways. I think this is really the next steps that where we're at the moment. And this is, of course, it will depend on if we're dealing with discrimination as racism, sexism, ableism, and so on and so forth. So this will not be a one fixer. This is actually the capacity to be in that discomfort and to dare hold on to that moment without knowing how it's going to unfold, but knowing that you know how to take care of it in ethically considerable and caring ways.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, Sheena.
I think it really made me think about the context and the environment. I don't know a better word for it, that actually allows that discomfort to feel okay or to feel palatable. Because I think something that has come up in different events I've been part of is we talk about, say, spaces or self-organized forms of solidarity, for example, which feel intuitive and embodied, and you connect to certain individuals who have similar skills of active listening or suspending one's own ego in order to lean into discomfort. But that is not as common as it could be if we're talking about proliferating this work across universities, not just concentrating or not only concentrating it amongst people who are already in equity sort of practice or those who are curious. And yeah, so how do you build spaces of vulnerability that allow people to not get it right and explore experiences that they never have done, certainly in the workplace before? And I think that for me has been the real kind of challenge. And it becomes a real interpersonal endeavor because you can't do these in large scale events or school level meetings or even across particularly big groups. And so, yeah, how do you build within the power dynamics of institutions? How do you build spaces where these conversations are okay and are not going to be politicized at a later date or reabsorbed by, managerial, I don't know, architectures that then reduce that space? And I guess I do want to be hopeful, though. I was just thinking about those good examples that I was quite struggling to think about, but there's been some great work around, sexual harassment and student activism against sexual harassment, reducing the use of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, so that you're not silencing victims. And there's been also some great work on decolonizing the curriculum. And so, in terms of marginalized voices, I think that there's this kind of, how do we make space for more forms of solidarity where it's not the majority kind of categories of difference then having to subsume lots of of the marginalized voices, and how do we make space for that? And I guess that's a key one for me. And going back to sort of just another thought I had based on that kind of the first question, that racism or discrimination being experienced in non-typical ways, made me also think about the new forms of imperialism that might come into play through things like language and the prevalence of the English language, and and having to work across different languages, and for many, not having to do that. So it's not equal labor. And I think that's a really difficult part of academic work as well, is what are the new forms of imperialism or silences that are created, not as a result of DI work, but through the structures of academic work more broadly. And sometimes those that feel much more immovable. But I don't think I'm the right one to be talking about that, given that I'm speaking in my sort of main language.
But thanks so much for all of those reflections. And Sheena, when you were speaking as well, and talking also about pedagogies and like kind of where do we take these spaces up, I want to connect that to one of the questions that have come into the chat, and we also talked about it with Antonios at the session on ableism, and we talked about it as well with Irina and the anti-queerness, anti-transness, about kind of norm critical pedagogies, and Antonia's reminded of Audre Lorde's brilliant quote about how the classroom is still one of the most radical spaces in the university. And so wondering your thoughts on what actions do we recommend that the teachers among us take up in their teaching. I don't know if you want to start with that, Sheena, since you just left off with.
Yeah, sure. That's a big one, isn't it? We have these conversations certainly at Bristol kind of ad infinitum on how, I feel like the student cohort that I teach is very different from that 10 years ago, and there is much more unspeakability, and that means you have to be a much more agile teacher, I guess, being able to sense what it's possible to talk about. We have had some not great examples of colleagues trying to bring in very difficult topics, for example, slavery, but then not creating, I guess, just what I was talking about, those, not cultivating those spaces by which to have a safe-ish conversation. Safe is probably not the right term, but a situation where students then don't feel, students of color in particular, don't feel uncomfortable in very disproportionate ways. And so we've had, Bristol has, the institution as well as the city has been reckoning with its relationship with the slave trade and the history of slavery for some time now, but certainly in the business school it has been quite challenging to realize Lord's idea of the kind of radical space. And I'd love to hear more about the Danish context. I want to be more hopeful here, and I think that if more work is done on kind of in non-classroom spaces to get students to think about some of these issues, then it'll be much easier to bring those into the classroom. But I found it much more of a challenge now than years ago, because I think the censorship in UK institutions and the very live conversations around free speech, and that's been particularly evident with the gender critical scholars with free speech arguments in the UK. It's made it actually more difficult to have these spaces, and I would love to hear how to be further along that journey of the radical spaces of the classroom being a nourishing and progressive place. But I think currently, I will speak, I guess, I can't speak for every institution in the UK, but it feels very challenging.
Thanks for sharing, Sheena. Me or Mira, do you want to jump in and speak a little bit to the Danish context?
Yeah, thank you, Sheena. And I think I first want to touch upon the very basic issue of, I think, the space that you talked about before, Sheena, creating a space. I don't think safe spaces necessarily, but at least accountable spaces are also dependent on the size of the classes, right? So if you have 120 students, creating a radical course, a norm-critical pedagogy will be extremely difficult. And I can't imagine how to do that. But sometimes we are lucky enough to have smaller classes, right? And for example, next Tuesday, I'm going to have a class and we're going to be, I guess, around 20. And it will be around norm critique and norm critical methods. And they are going to develop a norm critical design for specific areas that they want to work with. So these are really, I think as teachers, we really need to also think, where do I have conditions on which I can develop these radical spaces, or at least where I can add or push the discussions and the reflexivity amongst the students to new places, but where I still have the conditions of being able to take somewhat care of it. And I think this is really also a critical issue in higher education systems, where we are pressured to include more and more and more because of economic reasons, right? It becomes harder and harder to create those spaces and to really push the discussions and follow through the discussions. But I do think, at least in the Danish systems, and this of course also depends on which educational program you're in, but we do have classes that are small enough to actually experiment with this. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that we really need to think much more collegially, because I cannot become radical on my own, right? Everything is relationally performative. So I need my great colleagues. I need time to think with literature and with history and potential futures. So I think this kind of also daring to insist that this is time consuming, and it's just as important labor of writing a new paper or going to a conference to create those more radical courses where we really have to think through the different aspects of teaching. And so I guess my point here is also really to think, what are the conditions I have as a teacher? Can I see certain moments or spaces where this could be possible? And can I insist on having the working conditions, the hours to put in the efforts to create something that can be radical with my colleagues? That's at least, I cannot imagine doing those things without those three areas being included.
Thank you so much for that, Mi. I can see that we're running out of time, unfortunately, for today. So I'm going to ask one last question. And I want to link this back to the conversations that we're having. Sheena, you talked a lot about feminist futures, and we talked about feminist solidarity also across the 5 different seminars. And so one of the questions that has also come in is, how can we create and encourage more male allies? And I think it's an important thing to address when we're also talking about privilege, when we're talking about power, when we're talking about positionality and also institutional positionality. And so is this through the collegial solidarity that you're talking about, Mi? Is this through the critical utopian work? Is this through something totally else? So how do we do that kind of work? I'll pass it to you first, Mira.
I think the best way for me to respond to that is that if we understand discrimination as structural, historical, cultural, institutionalized, and as part of what we're living in, we need to move into a more knowledgeable understanding of what that actually means. And that would be, in one way, certainly to say that this is not about those, like, what do you call it? Like, it's not just the oppressed versus the non-oppressed. It's a much more complex and interwoven problem in which everybody's actually implicated. Yes, that may implicate you in the sense that you have privileges you did not ask for, did not know you were going to have, and that you take for granted, but you are certainly implicated in your different privileged positionalities as well, which also puts you in the position of being in this very contentious debate in the bad guys versus the good guys space. So if we were to think this more as a collective and shared challenge and shared burden, and invite people in from a slightly different vantage point than the little bit of the savior perspective. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that, of course, that all the Persians are equal in any. That's not to speak to that at all, but it is to speak to the fact that we are in no way, this notion of us being this us against them notion is an extremely debilitating and problematic way to go to this issue. And Bell Hooks has talked about this, and a lot of other people have talked about that. We need to see ourselves as part of the solution, all of us. And if you invite, I'm assuming it means white men, I'm not sure, but I guess all men or people in privileged positions, if this conversation becomes relevant for everybody, with the recognition and the necessary discomfort of having to address one's own privilege and so forth, this conversation can create more allyship, because all of a sudden it's not us and them anymore. And one of the great wins of this political discussion is creating more splitting by saying it's an us and them discussion. I've never seen it as that. I've never understood why we all fall into the us and them. Well, I do understand theoretically, but I still don't get it. Like, it's not that hard to see that we're being played. Right? So this is a shared burden, and invite people in as part of that shared burden. But don't pretend it's not going to be comfortable. I think we need to normalize the discomfort for everybody also, and maybe more the discomfort for the majoritized positions. So that's what I was thinking.
Thanks so much for that, Mira. We only have 2 minutes left, so Sheena and me, if you've got some 1-2 sentence, if you want to add anything to what Mira's saying, please do.
Yeah, just I guess very quickly, I think we've got to suspend sometimes a sense of shame around our distributed privileges. So, I think a key driver for sometimes anti-DEI sentiment is that many people who would be socially designated as having certain privileges don't feel that they have. And so the resentment that then comes out of that is a barrier to opening up the conversations and creating the shared burden that you're talking about, Mira. And I guess, the difficult work of trying to reduce that resentment would open up maybe the potential for normalizing that discomfort and sharing the burden. So yeah, that maybe the language of who is designated particular privileges is one that's not helpful for creating the context and for the type of work that we're talking about.
Thanks so much, Sheena. Me?
Yeah, just very quickly. I would say we should just do it, and I think we are doing it. So Sheena and I, we've been part of a network that we renamed to Feminist Network instead of Women's Network, and what happened? All genders started joining us. So this is really also thinking we have agency here. We can do it. And I know lots of genders who are interested in helping and being allies in sexism issues, just as it is with other discriminatory areas. So I think we should really just take that seriously and start thinking of ourselves as allies with everyone else instead of thinking in those oppositional terms that we are trained to think in.
Thanks so much for that, Mia, and also a very helpful reminder for all of us to also be also reflective in our work. Bonto, I'll hand it back to you.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'll also go out with this thing of let's just do it. It is exactly 4 o'clock now, so I'll only take a minute to wrap us up. I just want to say a huge thank you to all 3 of you, Mira and Sheena, for everything you shared and your inputs and the discussions. It's been really a pleasure discussing with you, learning from and with you. And I'm sure the audience is feeling the same way. I'm already seeing some comments in the chat on this. And we're actually coming to the end not only of this webinar session, but of the whole series. I'm almost a bit sad saying it because I really truly enjoyed these conversations that we've been having over the past 5 weeks. But of course, it's not the end of this work. It's going to continue. And I hope that the insights that were shared during the webinars will inspire and enable and support many to act against discrimination continuously. In whichever formal and informal and connected ways that we can. What I do want to say is if you were not able to join the full webinar series, maybe you missed a session or 2, or maybe you want to go back to a session at some point, I'm happy to let you know that the recordings of the sessions will be made publicly available online. We will edit them in the next weeks, and then the videos should be ready by end April, start May. And when they will, we will send you an email to all the participants who had signed up to the series. And we also encourage you to share them with your colleagues or in your own networks and to really boost the important conversations that we've had together with our amazing speakers over the past weeks. So once again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us throughout the whole series. It's been really great to see how many of you showed up consistently for each of the sessions. Thank you again, Mira. Thank you, Sheena. Thank you, Mia. Thank you also, Molly and Liu. It's been such a pleasure working with you on this webinar series. I really enjoyed it so much. And yeah, thank you to everyone and goodbye.